Thank you for lending an ear to the Voice of the Times for Wednesday, November 10, 2021. For today's editorial, Philippines should adopt just transition principles to fight climate change. A key initiative to emerge from this week's COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland actually happened on the sidelines just before the main conference opened. The Asian Development Bank or ADB and other multilateral development banks or MDBs adopted a joint statement committing to 5 high-level principles for a just transition in climate funding. As a major client of ADB and other MDBs, the Philippines should likewise incorporate these principles into its own climate adaptation and energy transition policies. In the joint statement, the MDBs outlined how they intend to support countries to move away from the use of fossil fuels, reduce greenhouse gas or GHG emissions, and work toward climate resilience in a way that shares the costs and benefits while supporting and protecting communities, industries, and workers. The statement added that the MDBs will also work with national development banks and other financial institutions to develop financing and policy strategies supporting a just transition that promotes economic diversification and inclusion. The idea of a just transition was introduced in the 2015 Paris Agreement, which established a goal of limiting the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. However, until now, the just transition idea has been largely an abstract aspiration. Climate across have recognized its importance, but have not done much to incorporate it into policies and programs in a practical way. The 5 principles for a just transition are rather broad, which is perhaps to be expected since they were formed as a part of a global level statement of intentions. They include delivering climate objectives while enabling socio-economic outcomes and building progress on Paris Agreement goals and the Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs. Support for countries to move away from GHG emissions, intensive economic activities through financing, policy and advisory activities, and knowledge sharing, mobilization, and enhanced coordination of public and private finance for climate response, support for affected workers and communities to mitigate impacts and increase opportunities, and transparent and inclusive planning and monitoring with relevant stakeholders and affected groups. What makes these principles more important now with the signing of the joint statement among the MDBs is that such statements rather quickly are translated into operating standards and guidelines. Every grant or loan created by an MDB has a list of safeguards and conditions attached to it, among which are explanations of how the corresponding projects respond to key priorities such as environmental impact, gender concerns, and, as will now be the case when climate-related projects are concerned, just transition principles. It is perhaps easier to understand if one remembers that despite the developmental character of their work, MDBs are still banks in a business sense. They do not have a profit objective, but in terms of businesses, processes, and practices, they want to ensure that their transactions are consistent, efficient, relevant, and properly address risks, just as any commercial bank would when extending a loan to a customer. ADB and other institutions will work with a client, government, or organization to craft a project proposal to satisfy the bank's checklist of priorities and requirements, but usually only to the extent of refining the proposal. After all, if too much intervention is required, the cost-benefit relationship suffers. Thus, it is in government's best interest to understand what prospective development partners like the NDBs expect to be addressed in a proposed project and make an effort to include those answers in its proposal. Now that the principles of just transition have been prioritized by the recent agreement of the MDBs, the Philippine government, which has made much of its climate response goals conditional on receiving external assistance, must include those principles in its climate strategy and policy, or risk losing out on some development aid. Action on a just transition will deepen ADB's commitment to action on climate change, a key plank of ADB's Strategy 2030. ADB recently announced it is raising its ambition for 2019 to 2030 cumulative climate financing to $100 billion, which will help DMCs achieve and even increase their Paris Agreement commitments to chart a fair and equitable path to net zero climate resilient development. And that's the editorial for Wednesday, November 10, 2021. For more news and information, get a copy of the Manila Times on print, subscribe to its digital edition, or log on to www.manilatimes.net. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and listen to the Voice of the Times.